It was supposed to be just another late-night political dialogue. Lights on, cameras rolling, pre-scripted introductions. But beneath Elizabeth Warren's composed smile, something deeper stirred, a determination to confront, to challenge what she believed was a dangerous complacency. Ted Cruz, poised as ever, stepped onto the stage with a calculated calm, a confidence that unsettled more than applause could soothe. No one anticipated the pointed question Elizabeth would pose, and even fewer were prepared for the answer Ted was ready to deliver. The studio of the talk show Face to Face was a marvel of modern media craft. Backlit glass panels shimmered in subtle hues of navy and silver, giving the stage a courtroom-like gravitas. Everything, from the sleek armchairs positioned for confrontation to the overhead lights gleaming like spotlights of judgment, had been designed for this moment. A special episode, two ideological titans, one defining conversation. But beneath the polished surface, beyond the rehearsed smiles and countdowns, there was a different kind of tension in the air. Unspoken, electric. Helena Cortez, the show's host and one of the most respected journalists in American media, adjusted her earpiece backstage. She had interviewed presidents, Nobel laureates, and revolutionaries. Yet tonight, even she could feel the weight of this encounter. Elizabeth Warren and Ted Cruz, names that carried their own gravity, would meet not just to exchange views, but to unveil the ideological clash that simmered beneath the surface of American discourse. She stepped onto the stage as the floor manager signaled. 30 seconds, Helena. We're live nationwide. Helena nodded, smoothing the lapels of her blazer and stepping into the spotlight. As the theme music swelled, the countdown echoed. 5, 4, 3, 2, cue the lights, cue the audience, cue the reckoning. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Helena greeted the crowd, her voice steady but charged. Tonight's face-to-face is not just a conversation, it's a meeting of convictions. We are joined by two figures who've shaped political thought not only through their policies, but through the battles they have chosen and the causes they have championed. The audience buzzed with anticipation. First, Helena continued, a woman whose name is synonymous with advocacy for economic justice, a former Harvard professor turned senator, a fighter for the middle class. Please welcome Senator Elizabeth Warren. The audience erupted in applause. As the theme from Ain't No Mountain High Enough played, Elizabeth Warren entered with purposeful energy, shaking hands with audience members in the front row, exchanging a quick, warm hug with Helena, and taking her seat with the assuredness of someone who had spent a lifetime standing up to powerful interests. Helena waited for the noise to settle before speaking again. And now, she said, a man known for his sharp legal mind, a champion of constitutional originalism, and one of the most prominent conservative voices in America. Please welcome Senator Ted Cruz. The music shifted, more reserved, more somber. Ted Cruz walked onto the stage in a dark, perfectly tailored suit, a burgundy tie knotted meticulously at his collar. He nodded politely to Helena and extended a firm handshake to Warren, a handshake she returned with professional, measured grace. Ted's eyes, however, held something more, a flash of challenge, a readiness for ideological combat that Warren recognized immediately. Helena gestured for them to sit across from one another, twin armchairs separated only by a small, symbolic table, neutral ground. Senator Warren, Senator Cruz, welcome, Helena said, her tone warm but firm. Tonight, this stage belongs to you. No scripts, no filters, just a conversation the nation is waiting to hear. The lights dimmed slightly, the cameras tightened their focus, and the air thickened with anticipation. No filters, no scripts, just conversation. The world is listening. The lights dimmed slightly, the cameras zoomed in, and the atmosphere tightened with expectation. Elizabeth Warren leaned back, her smile steady but edged with intent. I have to say, Warren began, voice almost playful, I've always wanted to share a stage with you, Senator Cruz. You've got this whole constitutional purist thing going on. Sometimes I wonder if you're about to quote Hamilton or launch into a courtroom cross-examination. The audience chuckled politely. Ted Cruz allowed a small, knowing smile. We all defend something, he said quietly, even when all we're trying to do is speak. Warren raised an eyebrow, not the expected soundbite, but she rolled with it. Can I be blunt? She asked, leaning forward slightly. Cruz gave a single nod. Warren paused, let the moment stretch, then said, You ever wonder if your career would have reached higher if you weren't so rigid? A few gasps rippled through the audience, followed by uneasy silence. Even Helena's eyebrows lifted at the audacity of the question. Ted Cruz didn't flinch, didn't blink. He simply tilted his head slightly, as if the question had been waiting all along and only now had a voice. The audience shifted in their seats, A few awkward chuckles tried and failed to break the tension. Cruz took a breath, his voice low, measured, not defensive, not angry, just centered. "What you call rigid," he said. "I call principled." It landed like a low thunderclap. Warren blinked. "Principled?" "Yes," Cruz said, "being grounded, not chasing the next political trend or pandering for applause, just standing firm." A murmur rose from the audience. Someone began to clap but stopped midway. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. Warren shifted, crossing one leg over the other. "That's noble," she said, "but Washington doesn't pay you to stand still. It pays you to solve problems. You stop adapting, you become irrelevant." Cruz nodded slowly. "And what happens when you adapt so much you lose the core of what you believe?" Warren was caught mid-breath. Helena glanced at her notes. This was nowhere on the script. Warren chuckled, but there was strain beneath it. "Look, I don't run away from challenges," she said. "I show up, I fight. I don't hide behind metaphors or speeches about original intent." Ted Cruz's gaze didn't waver. "Sometimes," he said calmly, "facing the Constitution as it was written is the hardest confrontation of all." Warren opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time, the smile faltered. The audience wasn't laughing anymore. They were listening. Helena leaned in gently. "Senator Cruz, you seem comfortable with ideological discomfort. Has that always been the case?" "No," he replied simply. "I had to learn it. I lost a lot. Respect, opportunities, timea. I stepped back from popularity before I understood what it meant to stand firm." Warren frowned slightly. "You stepped back?" Cruz nodded. "Not because I couldn't face the heat, but because I needed to hear something quieter. Principles." The noise was drowning out. He leaned in slightly, his voice steady, but laden with intent. "There's something I need to ask you, Senator Warren." Warren blinked, the confident grin fading just enough to betray a flicker of uncertainty. "All right," she said cautiously. "Go ahead." Cruz didn't fire the question immediately. He looked at her, not as an opponent, but as a reflection of the debate itself. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable but deliberate. Then he spoke. "Why did you really want this conversation?" Warren exhaled sharply, almost laughing. "Come on, it's good TV. Two senators, a clash of ideas. That's ratings gold." Cruz kept his eyes on her, steady, patient. Warren glanced at the audience, searching for familiar affirmation in the rhythm of politics. But the usual safety net of laughter and applause wasn't there. The energy had shifted. "All right," she added, shifting in her seat. "If you're fishing for something deeper, fine. Maybe I thought it'd be interesting. Two philosophies. Conflict, contrast." Cruz tilted his head thoughtfully. "Or maybe," Cruz said calmly, "you needed something." Warren paused, her jaw tightening slightly. Helena watched, silent, her eyes flicking between them, hands resting on her unused cue cards. She knew now. This was no longer her show. "Okay, Senator," Warren said with a chuckle that didn't reach her eyes. "What exactly do you think I needed?" Cruz didn't answer with an assumption. He didn't rush. Instead, he reflected the question back, steady but unyielding. "That's what I'm wondering, Senator Warren. What part of you thought I was the one you had to confront?" The audience shifted. Warren leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, settling into a defensive posture. "You've got this image," she said, her tone sharpened. "Untouchable. The constitutional scholar who stands above it all. Cold, methodical. Meanwhile, I've lived my fights out loud. Every mistake, every failure, broadcast for the world to see." Cruz nodded slowly, thoughtfully. "I know," he said, "and I'm sorry you had to endure that." Warren blinked. She hadn't expected compassion. It disarmed her more effectively than any sharp rebuttal. "But," Cruz continued, "the public doesn't respect me because I stay silent. They respect me because I stop campaigning for their approval." Warren looked down briefly, something flickering across her face, something dangerously close to recognition. "You think I'm campaigning right now?" she asked, voice quieter. Cruz didn't answer directly. Instead, he offered a story. "There was a voter," he said, "maybe 10 years ago. He stopped me after an event." He looked worn down, defeated. He didn't ask for a photo. He just said, "Your stand against the grain. It made me believe in the system again." And then he said, "You made me believe my voice mattered." The air thickened. Warren swallowed hard. Even Helena looked visibly moved. "I didn't say anything back," Cruz continued. I just shook his hand. We stood there, silent. That moment said more than 1,000 stump speeches. Warren leaned back, her eyes focused far beyond the studio lights. "I know that kind of pain," she said softly. "I've carried it, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep pushing, keep making it, keep being Elizabeth Warren." Cruz let the silence sit for a moment before speaking again. "Sometimes," he said, "the noise keeps us from hearing what's really breaking." Warren looked up, this time with no rehearsed performance in her gaze. "So you just retreated after your losses?" she asked. Cruz nodded. I didn't want to be part of a system that could betray its own ideals, he said. But you came back, Warren pointed out, voice firmer. You're still here, still debating, still legislating. Because I realize retreat isn't surrender, Cruz said. It's preparation. Warren frowned slightly. Preparation for what? Cruz's answer was immediate, without hesitation. For the truth. A murmur rolled through the audience. Warren let the words hang there, suspended, then leaned forward. You want truth? She said, her voice sharpening, not in anger, but in a kind of weary defiance. You talk about principles like they're sacred relics, but not everyone has the luxury of standing still. I didn't get to disappear when things got hard. When the attacks came, when the failures hit, I had to stand there, face it, own it, rebuild. You, Warren said, her voice firm, you vanish, then reappear. Untouched, untouchable. Cruz didn't flinch. And that angers you, he said. Warren stared at him, then unexpectedly, she laughed, a low, bitter laugh. I guess it does. Silence. Then Cruz spoke again, voice even, steady. Maybe because you think the only way to earn respect is to suffer publicly. Warren's eyes narrowed. She opened her mouth and shut it again. You think respect is won through applause, Cruz continued, but applause fades. It always fades. Helena finally spoke, voice cautious. But don't we all seek validation in some form? Cruz turned to her, his expression softening, but his tone remained firm. Validation, he said, is like sugar. It gives you a rush, but its presence, real conviction, that sustains. The audience sat in deep silence now, not from boredom, but reverence. For the first time, Warren looked truly tired, not physically, but emotionally drained. You know what, Senator? She said quietly. Warren spoke again, her voice softer now. Sometimes, she said, I wonder what would have happened if I had been quieter. If I hadn't fought so loud, so publicly, maybe people wouldn't hate me so much. People don't hate you, Cruz replied, his voice calm. They just don't know how to carry the weight of your battles. Warren looked at him, then away. And what about you? She asked. What do you do with your losses? Cruz sat with the question. His eyes didn't waver. I don't fight them, he said. I sit with them. I walk with them. And some days, they walk me. Warren was silent. The audience was too. Even the camera operator seemed to barely breathe. Then Cruz leaned forward. Can I ask you something else? Warren gave a faint nod. What would happen, Cruz said, if you stopped being Senator Elizabeth Warren for just one night? Warren didn't answer. Her jaw clenched. Her eyes were glossy now, but she fought the emotion rising within her. Cruz didn't press. He simply sat there, steady, present, and somehow that silence was louder than anything Warren had ever faced. Warren opened her mouth as if to speak, but before she could, Cruz raised his hand, a slight, almost imperceptible gesture. There's one more thing I need to know, he said. Warren looked up, bracing herself. Cruz's voice dropped to a whisper, but it echoed like a verdict. Who are you when no one's clapping? He leaned in, eyes calm but unflinching. Why did you really want this conversation? Warren smirked, trying to maintain control. Come on, Senator. It's good television. Two strong voices, opposite sides. It sells. Cruz didn't blink. No, there's something deeper. Warren shifted uneasily. The crowd could feel it too. All right, she said, more guarded now. Maybe I wanted contrast. Fire and water. Conflict. Cruz tilted his head slightly. Or maybe, he said, you needed to confront something. In me. Or in yourself. Warren looked away, then back. You know what I hate? She muttered. That people worship your calm. You barely say anything, and they treat you like you're some oracle of truth. Cruz remained still. And that bothers you? Hell yes, it does, Warren snapped. I've fought. I've struggled. I've bled politically for every inch. And you just exist. And somehow they love you more for it. Cruz responded gently, almost reflective. Maybe they're not loving me, he said. Maybe they're loving the space I leave for them to see themselves. Warren paused. Something in her expression cracked. You ever feel like you're running just to stay visible? All the time, Cruz said. Until I stopped, Warren scoffed. Easy for you to say. You disappeared. You had the luxury of silence. I stayed. I took the hits. I wore the scars. I rebuilt. And did that bring you peace? Cruz asked, voice even. Warren didn't answer. Cruz's tone softened. I've lost people too, he said. Mentors, allies, friendships. I didn't vanish because I was enlightened. I vanished because I was grieving. Warren looked at him, really looked. And the silence helped? She asked. No, Cruz said. At first it swallowed me, but eventually it became a place where I could hear my own voice again. Warren leaned back, whispering, I don't know what mine sounds like anymore. Cruz leaned in closer. That's why we're here. Warren blinked, emotions rising, voice unsteady. I came to expose you, she said, to make you crack. but all I've done is crack open myself. Maybe that's the point, Cruz said quietly. Warren's voice cracked. You don't understand, she said. I need the noise, the interviews, the rallies, the causes. I need the validation. Cruz nodded. We all need love, he said. But if it only exists when you're performing, is it love or is it applause? The question landed like a blow. Warren looked down. You think I'm still campaigning? I think you're tired, Cruz said softly. The silence stretched, not tense but full of recognition. Warren looked up, her voice almost breaking. You know the scariest thing? Cruz waited. I don't know who I am when the cameras turn off. Cruz's reply was steady, firm, but gentle. Then maybe it's time to find out. Warren didn't respond, but something in her seemed to quietly collapse. She wasn't posturing anymore. She wasn't debating. She was finally listening. The silence in the studio was no longer awkward. It was transformative. Elizabeth Warren looked up at Ted Cruz, still reeling from everything that had been said. You know what? She said, her voice lower now, almost defeated. People only respect you because you don't talk. Cruz didn't blink. And what if that's true? Then maybe if you spoke more, Warren continued, they'd see who you really are. And maybe they wouldn't like it. Cruz's reply was soft, unwavering. You think respect has to be loud to be real? Warren stood halfway from her chair, then sat back down, frustrated. I earned every bit of respect I have, she said. Every fight, every speech. I fought for it. And what if I earned mine by stopping the fight? Cruz asked gently. The audience leaned in, sensing the rawness of the moment. Warren's jaw clenched. You hide behind principles, she accused. You speak in riddles and doctrine. Cruz nodded slowly. Or maybe, he said, I just got tired of performing pain for a world that doesn't know what to do with conviction. Warren exhaled sharply. You think I like performing? I think you forgot who you are underneath it, Cruz replied. Warren paused, her eyes darting between Cruz and the audience. I don't even know anymore, she admitted, voice cracking. Cruz leaned forward. Then maybe, he said, that's the question you have been avoiding. Warren swallowed hard. You don't get it, she said, her voice almost breaking. If I stop fighting, I disappear. Or maybe, Cruz said quietly, you return. Warren looked up sharply. You ever feel like you're a character in someone else's story? Cruz's gaze didn't waver. Every day, he said, until I decided to walk off the page. Helena remained silent, barely breathing. Warren's voice cracked. You know what scares me? She whispered. The idea that no one would care if I was just me. Cruz tilted his head slightly. Then let's test it, he said. Take the mask off, right here, right now. Warren gave a bitter laugh. You say that like it's easy. It's not, Cruz said. It's honest. Warren stood slowly. She turned to face the audience, then back to Cruz. I built a version of myself that people admire, she said, but I don't know if I admire her. Cruz stepped closer. Then maybe it's time to meet the version who doesn't need applause. Warren looked at him, eyes glassy. Do you think she's worth meeting? Cruz's voice was steady. I think she's waiting. Warren sat again, trembling slightly. I wanted to break you tonight, she said, almost confessing. I wanted to prove you weren't this untouchable mystery. Cruz stayed calm. And? Warren sighed, a long, weary breath. I think I'm the one breaking. Cruz didn't move, didn't smile. Then you're finally being honest. Warren looked up at him, whispering, I forgot who I was before the campaigns, before the Senate. Cruz leaned forward, his voice low, carrying the weight of something real. Then let's remember together. Elizabeth Warren sat there in silence, her jaw tight, her breathing uneven. Then she spoke again, voice hollow but clear. You want the truth? She asked. Cruz stayed silent, giving her the space. Warren looked down. I didn't invite you here because I admire you. The audience held their breath. I invited you because I wanted to beat you, she said. The studio froze. I've spent years watching people respect you for being still, she continued. I fought, I screamed, I took every hit for the causes I believe in. And you just stand there, and somehow they love you more. Cruz didn't react. I hated that, Warren said, because I felt like if I ever stopped pushing, I'd disappear. Cruz nodded softly. Trying what? Warren's voice cracked. Trying to be enough. The words hung in the air like a confession no one dared to interrupt. I perform because I don't trust silence, Warren said. In silence, I hear the fear, the doubt, the things I've been running from since I was a kid. Cruz leaned in slightly. And what happens if you stop running? Warren gave a bitter laugh. I don't know, maybe I collapse. Cruz's reply was gentle but firm. Then maybe it's time to collapse. Warren stared at him, stunned. You're saying fall apart? I'm saying stop pretending you're not already breaking. Warren covered her mouth with her hand. Her shoulders trembled slightly. Then she spoke again. I missed recitals, birthdays, Warren said, her voice barely above a whisper. I told myself I was building a future for them, but really, I was hiding in the work. Cruz nodded slowly. You weren't building a life, he said. You were building a disguise. Warren's voice faltered, dropping lower. You ever wonder what you pass down to your kids besides the money? Cruz's response was quiet but cutting. We pass on what we don't heal. Warren closed her eyes as if bracing herself. I don't know how to forgive myself. It starts with honesty, Cruz said. And you're already doing that. Warren opened her eyes, red but clear. You really think I can come back from all this? Cruz didn't hesitate. You don't need to come back. You just need to show up. A silence followed, but this time it was different. Peaceful, not empty. Warren smiled through the tears, a small, tremulous smile. You talk like someone who's already buried the worst parts of himself. Cruz met her gaze. I have, he said, and I visit the grave often. Warren exhaled. You said earlier, the world doesn't need versions of me. It needs me. Cruz nodded. The world needs the person, not the performance. Warren shook her head slowly. I wish someone had told me that before. Maybe, Cruz said. You weren't ready to hear it until now. They sat there, no longer Senator Elizabeth Warren and Senator Ted Cruz. No titles, no masks, just people, just truth. Ted Cruz sat still, the weight of his experiences resting quietly in his expression. Warren looked at him, quieter now, stripped of the armor she had worn for decades. Why are you always so calm? She asked. Cruz exhaled slowly. Because I lost everything and didn't know how to keep breathing. Warren sat up straighter, listening. When people I loved were gone, Cruz continued, the world went silent. It wasn't peace, it was emptiness. I stopped smiling, I stopped feeling. People called it stoicism, mystery, but really, I was just broken. Warren nodded slowly, understanding in her eyes. And no one saw that, Cruz said. They saw what they wanted to see. But kindness, that was all I had left, and it didn't hurt. Warren's eyes welled up. That's why people trust you, she whispered. You don't fake your pain. Cruz looked at her, gentle but unflinching. And you do? Warren didn't answer right away. I faked everything, she said. Strength, forgiveness, joy. I gave people what they needed, so I wouldn't have to show them what I didn't have. The air thickened, heavy with truth. I compromised, Warren admitted. I lied to myself. I disappeared emotionally, all while smiling, while championing causes, while pretending. Cruz listened without judgment. You were trying to fix the image, he said, not the wound. Warren nodded slowly, the admission painful. I thought if I worked hard enough, gave enough, fought enough, they'd love me without the performance. But they never saw me, because I never showed me. Cruz leaned in slightly. Maybe now you are. Warren's voice dropped, intimate and raw. Sometimes I look at my kids, and I wonder what I've passed down. My fear, my need to be perfect. Cruz's voice softened even more. We pass on what we don't heal. Warren wiped her eyes. I built a life people admire, but I don't admire the person who lives it. Cruz looked at her with unwavering calm. Then maybe it's time to meet the person who doesn't need applause. I don't know who that is. He's still there, just quieter. Helena, nearly in tears, finally found her voice. Senator Warren, what would you say to her? The woman behind the image? Warren hesitated. Then she spoke, voice trembling, but sure. I'm sorry I left you behind. Cruz smiled, soft and knowing. That's a start. Another long silence passed, but this one was healing, not hollow. Warren looked up again. How do you forgive yourself? She asked. Cruz answered quietly, by staying, by not abandoning the parts of you that hurt. Forgiveness isn't a moment, he said. It's presence, Flag. Warren nodded. I think I've spent my whole life running from stillness. Cruz reached out, placing a hand gently on her shoulder, then stopped running. Warren's eyes watered again. I think I just met myself, she said. Cruz smiled softly. And you're still here. The studio was silent, not with awkwardness, but with something sacred, something real, having unfolded. Elizabeth Warren sat still, eyes red but steady. Ted Cruz was beside her, grounded, calm, open. Helena finally broke the stillness, voice trembling slightly. Senator Warren, would you like to say something? Warren stood up slowly. No bravado, no performance, just breath. I brought Senator Cruz here to prove something, she said, to show the world that he's just a man. She turned to look at him, her voice steady. But tonight, he showed me that I'm just a person, and that's enough. She faced the audience. I've spent my whole life chasing applause, thinking that's where love came from.